Welcome to Close Your Eyes, Listen to Stories. Close your eyes, relax, and let me take you into the story. Before you meet the coonskin cap, the ballads, or the painted posters, you meet a river. It slides past the Tennessee settlements with a patient sound, touching stones, roots, and the rough edge of a young country that has not yet decided what shape it will take. If you stay there for a moment, with the Nolichucky moving under pale light and the ridges standing blue in the distance, you can begin to see why a man like Davy Crockett would later feel larger than life. The place itself already carried that feeling. He was born David Crockett in 1786, near Limestone in the short-lived state of Franklin, a place born from argument, hunger, and frontier stubbornness. His father, John, had the kind of life that seemed always one flood, one debt, or one misfortune away from being overturned. The family moved again and again. A gristmill washed away. Land was lost. A tavern had to be built where travelers came through. The world around young Davy was not a settled town with smooth doors and easy promises. It was a borderland of wagon ruts, creek crossings, and hard reckonings. You can feel, in that unsettled childhood, the making of a man who learned early that comfort could vanish by morning. His family history already sounded like something told over a fire. One grandfather line reached back to French Huguenot roots, then through Ulster, then into the American backcountry. His father had served among the over-mountain men during the Revolution. There were stories of raids, losses, and kin carried away into captivity. Such things do not make a child gentle, but they can make him alert. Crockett grew up watching adults measure distance by danger and opportunity at once. A trail could bring trade, news, or ruin. A stranger might be a guest, a creditor, or both. When he was still young, his father bound him out to work off family debts. That part of the story matters because it strips away the shiny varnish that later legend applied. This was not a child wandering a magical wilderness with endless freedom. He was a boy traded into labor because money had run out. He drove cattle toward Virginia, slept outdoors, watched weather gather across the road, and learned how far a body could travel when it had no choice. Then, after a schoolyard fight and the threat of a whipping, he ran. He drifted through wagon work and long trips east, even apprenticed for a time to a hatter in Virginia, which is not the sort of detail folk songs like to keep, though it tells you a great deal. The future hero once spent his days around felt, tools, and trade work rather than glory. Years later, the legend would claim that he killed a bear when he was only 3 years old, popular tradition. It is a bright, impossible image, and perhaps that is why it lasted. But the truer picture is almost more interesting. The real boy did not begin as a fearless giant. He began as a restless runaway who slowly learned how to read country, judge people, talk his way into work, and endure. The wilderness did not kneel for him. He had to study it. The adults around him did not bow before his destiny. He had to outlast them, charm them, or bargain with them. By the time he came back to Tennessee, he had lengthened into a young man who knew the cost of bread, distance, and pride. He worked to pay his father's debts, then stayed on at the same homestead where he had labored. He fell in love unwisely at first, as young men often do, then married Polly Finley in 1806 after a stubborn courtship that was part romance and part frontier negotiation. Their life together began without ceremony in the grand sense. There was land to clear, crops to tend, game to find, children to raise. Yet in such plain beginnings, the Crockett story took root. He was not born famous. He became visible by becoming useful. What people noticed first was not that he glittered, but that he moved through difficulty with a kind of rough humor. He could hunt. He could travel. He could tell a story so that a cabin seemed warmer around him. He could make hardships sound survivable, which on a frontier might have been the nearest thing to magic. A man like that gathers listeners before he gathers legends. One neighbor repeats a tale to another. A joke made after a hunt turns into a local story. A local story becomes a county story. And somewhere in the middle of that widening circle, David becomes Davy. If you listen carefully, you can hear the legend beginning not with a trumpet, but with bootsteps in mud, wagon wheels grinding over roots, and the sound of a young husband trying to build a life where very little was guaranteed. The frontier often made harsh men. Crockett did become hard in some ways, but he also stayed porous to people, open to talk, eager to be remembered. That mixture mattered. A silent hunter can be admired. A talkative hunter who turns each memory into a spark can become something else. So the first truth of Davy Crockett is not the cap, not the rifle, not even the bears. It is movement, a boy carried by debt, a youth shaped by roads, a man growing up where the nation itself was still improvising. Long before the Alamo, long before Congress, long before songs declared him king of anything, he was already learning the oldest frontier lesson. You survive partly by strength, partly by wit, and partly by persuading others that your story deserves to travel farther than your body can. That is how a life begins to lean toward legend. In the years after his marriage, Crockett settled into the rhythm that shaped so many frontier households, clearing ground, planting corn, watching the weather, hunting when crops or cash fell short, and measuring the world by what it could yield before winter. Yet he never became merely still. Even when he was rooted to a farm, he carried the feeling of a traveler in him, as though one part of his mind was always scanning the next ridge. That restlessness made him good in the woods. It also made him visible in communities where a man needed to be more than strong. He needed to be memorable. He hunted often and well, not because the woods were a stage for heroics, but because meat, hides, and skill mattered. Frontier reputation was built by repeated usefulness. If a man could bring down game, track through bad weather, and return with something to feed several families, his name moved quickly. Davy Crockett's did. Later storytelling would make him a superhuman slayer of bears, a creature nearly as wild as the hills around him. The truth was quieter and more durable. He knew how to watch signs. He knew where animals crossed, where they watered, how the forest changed in sound just before something living appeared. Such knowledge is not flashy, but it is intimate, and intimacy with the land was one of the roots of his fame. Then war drew him south. In 1813, after violence on the frontier fed panic and fury, he joined a mounted rifle company in the campaign against the Creek. He marched under John Coffee, with Andrew Jackson rising over the whole conflict like a hard storm front. Crockett later remembered that he was better at hunting for soldiers than killing enemy fighters, and that admission matters. It does not turn him into a saint. It turns him back into a person. He marched in a brutal campaign, but he noticed hunger, exhaustion, and the need for food more than the intoxication of battle. That small honesty separates the historical man from the cardboard hero. He served again in 1814, though that later enlistment saw less fighting. When he came home, his first wife Polly died in 1815, leaving him with children and a grief that frontier stories often hurry past. There's a softness hidden inside this stage of his life. He asked family for help. He remarried, choosing the widow Elizabeth Patton, and the two of them built a household stitched together from children, labor, practicality, and affection earned through work. The Crockett home was never a polished domestic scene. It was busy, rough-edged, and alive with responsibility. But people who knew him understood that the hunter was also a man who kept returning to family, even after loss. By 1817, he had moved into Lawrence County, where his public life began almost accidentally, as public lives often do in new places. He helped mark boundaries. He served as a justice of the peace. He rose in the militia to lieutenant colonel. On paper, these roles looked tidy. In life, they were messy, local, and demanding. Boundaries meant disputes. Justice meant listening to neighbors whose tempers were as close as their cabins. Militia rank meant reputation as much as military brilliance. Crockett found that he could do something many stronger or richer men could not. He could speak in a way ordinary settlers trusted. That gift did not sound refined. He was not the kind of speaker who floated elegant phrases over a crowd and left no dust on his boots. He spoke in anecdotes, side turns, homely comparisons, and sharp comic timing. If you imagine him in those years, it helps to place him not on a grand platform, but on a courthouse square, in a tavern yard, or outside a mill, where men leaned on rails and listened first because he amused them, and then because, almost without noticing, they had begun to believe him. A frontier politician could not sound distant. Crockett sounded like somebody who had already lived the worst of the joke. He also carried the sympathies of a man who had known debt from childhood. He did not speak for the polished planter first. He tended to speak for settlers tangled in land claims, taxes, and systems too complicated for the people they ruled. That concern was not abstract. He knew what it was to be cornered by paperwork, by other men's notes, by an economy that could turn muscle into loss. If he sounded plain, it was because plainness let people hear themselves inside his words. The legend, meanwhile, kept gathering bark and color. Stories from hunts grew longer in the retelling. His size, aim, and endurance enlarged as they passed from mouth to mouth. Yet even as the tales stretched, the real Crockett was becoming more interesting, not less. He was a woodsman with public instincts, a family man with wandering energy, a militia officer who preferred foraging to bloodshed, and a local official who knew the law was often least friendly to those who needed fairness most. Folk heroes endure when they seem to belong to ordinary people, and Davy Crockett, for all his ambition, never quite stopped sounding like he came from their side of the fire. That is how the hunter learned to be heard. Not in a single triumph, not by stepping suddenly into legend, but by moving from cabin life into county life while keeping the smell of wood smoke on him. In many places, fame begins when a person leaves home. With Crockett, fame began because home kept sending him forward. The same voice that could joke after a hunt was learning how to turn complaint into argument and memory into persuasion. Before long, Tennessee would send that voice beyond the county line, and once it reached larger rooms, the country would begin its long habit of remaking the man into a symbol. When Crockett entered the Tennessee legislature in the 1820s, he did not arrive as a polished statesman descending to meet the common people. He arrived as one of them, carrying the look and cadence of the frontier into rooms that preferred cleaner cuffs and smoother sentences. His life had already taught him that institutions could be useful, but they were rarely gentle. So he pushed first on behalf of settlers who struggled with land titles, taxes, and the endless paper barriers that seemed to grow wherever the young republic claimed to bring order. His timing was not especially kind. A flood destroyed businesses he had built, debts pressed again, and he moved westward within Tennessee, beginning over in another place as he had before. That pattern of rebuilding shaped both his politics and his legend. He could talk about hardship without sounding theatrical, because he kept having to survive it. In 1827, he finally won a seat in the United States House of Representatives and traveled to Washington, boarding at Mrs. Ball's house with other lawmakers. It is a detail small enough to feel almost domestic, yet helps you imagine the scene. The future folk hero, later painted as if he belonged only to forests and battlefields, was also a boarding house congressman walking crowded corridors and listening for committee talk. In Congress, he remained fixated on the settlers' struggle for secure land. He had lived too close to uncertainty to forget it. He also made enemies by resisting the drift of power around Andrew Jackson. At first, he was no natural enemy of Jackson. Both men had frontier credentials. Both could wear roughness as political strength. But Jackson gathered loyalty like a magnet pulls filings, and Crockett proved stubborn where loyalty expected obedience. That stubbornness became one of the hinges of his life. The most remembered example is his opposition to the Indian Removal Act in 1830. He was the only member of Tennessee's delegation to vote against it. The vote cost him dearly at home, but it remains one of the clearest windows into his character. It would be too simple to turn that vote into pure virtue. Crockett was still a man of the frontier and of his era, and his life contains contradictions that do not dissolve easily. He had served in campaigns against Native people. He also enslaved people, though he later opposed some forms of concentrated power. History rarely gives you a spotless hero. What it gives, if you look steadily, is a man capable of both moral courage and moral limitation. Crockett belongs in that harder, truer category. Still, the vote mattered. Cherokee Chief John Ross thanked him for it, and Crockett himself later wrote that his conscience told him he had given an honest vote. You can feel, in that sentence, the plain religious cadence of a man measuring himself against judgment deeper than party triumph. He also attacked what he saw as privilege in government. In one little-known move, he argued against the public expense of West Point, believing elite institutions too often served wealthy families first. Whether or not you agree with him, the instinct is clear. He distrusted systems that seemed built to lift the already lifted. He won re-election, then lost, then returned again. Politics for Crockett was rarely smooth ascent. It was more like crossing a rocky stream, stepping from one unstable stone to another. During these same years, the country began shaping him into a public curiosity as much as a lawmaker. Newspapers noticed his frontier manner. Audiences loved his stories. He helped publish his own autobiography in 1834, partly to answer distorted versions of himself already circulating. That decision is wonderfully revealing. He understood that a person can lose ownership of his own life if other people start telling it first. Even the image later taken for granted was not yet fixed. The coonskin cap, so inseparable now from the Crockett silhouette, was never the full truth of how he dressed or presented himself. It became a stronger emblem through performance and later entertainment than through daily political life. The real congressman was less costume than contradiction, backwoods and ambitious, comic and serious, shrewd and impulsive, capable of turning laughter into leverage. In those Washington years, listeners often met two Crocketts at once. One was the man in the room, telling a story with such ease that opponents relaxed before realizing they were being cornered. The other was the imagined Crockett growing in pamphlets, gossip, and public appetite, the frontier giant, half hunter and half myth. America has always loved a figure who seems to rise from its edges and embarrass its centers. Crockett fit that desire perfectly. He could mock polish without seeming ignorant. He could speak for rough places without apologizing for them. Yet fame never settled his life. Elections still slipped away. Money still ran thin. Prestige did not cancel vulnerability. If anything, public life made him more exposed to disappointment, because now defeats happened in full view. By 1835, after another bitter electoral loss, he stood at an age when many men began to shrink their horizon. Crockett did the opposite. He turned toward Texas, where revolution was gathering, land promises were floating in the air, and the boundary between reinvention and ruin was once again thin enough for a restless man to step across. So if you picture him leaving Congress behind, do not imagine only wounded pride. Imagine also recognition. He had become a national figure, yes, but he remained inwardly the same moving person from the river country, more comfortable on a road than in a settled chair. The nation had tried to pin him to office, caricature, and slogan. He slipped the pin. He was heading toward the last great chapter of his life. And the strangest part is that by then the legend was already moving ahead of him, clearing space where the man would soon disappear. Before Crockett ever reached the Alamo, he had already become something Americans like to manufacture almost as much as they like to believe in it, a frontier marvel. The process was not entirely imposed from outside. He understood the value of storytelling and knew how a well-placed anecdote could enlarge a room. But once the public took hold of him, the growth of the legend no longer obeyed him. It spread through newspapers, stump speeches, stage pieces, and especially through the wildly exaggerated Crockett almanacs that delighted readers hungry for impossible feats. In those almanacs and later retellings, the line between man and fable loosened almost at once. He was said to have killed a bear at the age of 3, popular tradition. He was described as a figure so at home in the wilderness that ordinary rules bent around him. In later popular tradition, he was even imagined as being born on a mountaintop in Tennessee, greenest state in the land, as if geography itself had decided to sing him into being. These inventions tell you less about the literal man than about the country's appetite. People wanted the frontier distilled into one human shape, and Crockett's name was available. The real fascination lies in how he responded. He did not reject storytelling. He had too much delight in language for that. But he did resist being fully swallowed by falsehood. His autobiography, written with Thomas Chilton, was in part an attempt to recover some ownership over his image. You can almost feel him leaning over the page, saying in effect, "Let me tell you where I have actually been before others decide I have wrestled comets and frightened panthers with a wink." That struggle with self-invention feels surprisingly modern. He was not merely becoming famous. He was being branded, and yet the brand was powerful because it rested on some truth. Crockett really was a woodsman, a veteran, a politician from rough country, a gifted talker, and a man who wore confidence like a second shirt. Exaggeration rarely thrives without a sturdy seed beneath it. The almanac writers simply watered the seed with absurdity. They turned skill into miracle, temper into titanic force, and humor into mythic swagger. A bear story becomes 10 bear stories. A good shot becomes a superhuman marksman. A stubborn representative becomes the living spirit of frontier defiance. There was also theater in a more literal sense. The 19th century loved the stage version of the backwoods hero, and performers found in Crockett a role audiences immediately understood. The costume gradually fixed itself in public imagination. The cap, the rifle, the fringed clothing, the easy grin. By the 20th century, Disney would seal that image in bright, unforgettable form, but the process had begun much earlier. A person can spend years making a reputation only to watch a costume make a stronger one in half the time. If you linger with the historical Crockett here, just before Texas, he becomes most moving when the gap between his public mask and private uncertainty grows widest. He was famous, but not secure. He was admired, but not always elected. He was quoted, imitated, and enlarged, yet still vulnerable to debt, political defeat, and the ache of being misunderstood. That combination gives him depth. A purely triumphant hero grows dull. A man who can hear applause and still feel the floor shifting under him remains human. After his defeat in 1835, a famous line was attached to his departure for Texas, that his constituents might go to hell and he would go to Texas. Whether the exact phrasing reached print with some sharpening afterward, it fits the shape of his public image so well that it endured. It captures hurt pride, comic fury, and the frontier habit of turning disappointment into motion. Rather than sit inside defeat, he set his face toward another borderland. That, too, fed the myth. Americans love a figure who does not retreat inward after losing, but heads for a farther horizon. There's a strange tenderness in this stage of the story. You can feel the man and the legend walking side by side, neither able to dismiss the other. The man needed opportunities, land, and perhaps a fresh political future. The legend needed a final proving ground. Texas offered both. So he left Tennessee in November 1835, dressed for travel and remembered by his youngest daughter as wearing a hunting suit and coonskin cap. It is one of those moments where memory, history, and symbol line up so neatly that even a careful listener feels the pull of it. As he rode southwest, the stories rode with him. In town after town, people came out simply to see him. Not a governor, not a general, Davy Crockett. That fact alone tells you what he had become. He was no longer just a participant in American life. He was a portable piece of national imagination, carried by rumor, laughter, admiration, and exaggeration from one settlement to the next. Soon the road would end at San Antonio. Then the man would vanish in his smoke and argument, and the legend would begin its longest life. When Crockett left Tennessee for Texas in late 1835, he was 49 years old enough to know how badly adventures can end and young enough in spirit to chase one anyway. You can picture him moving west and south with companions through chill air and muddy roads, stopping in towns where news of revolution drifted ahead of certainty. He was not marching as a boy seeking glory. He was a seasoned man stepping once more into a place where history had not yet settled and where a restless reputation might still be useful. Crowds gathered to see him along the way. In Little Rock, people filled a hotel dinner in his honor. In every such stop, the double life of Davy Crockett traveled with him. There was the recognizable public figure, and there was the man himself, still needing choices to become bread, shelter, and future. Texas offered volunteers land and purpose. It also offered risk in its purest frontier form. In January 1836, near Nacogdoches, Crockett and other volunteers swore loyalty to the Provisional Government of Texas for a 6-month term. Each man was promised land. The old frontier bargain returned once more. Service now, possibility later. He reached San Antonio in early February and entered the Alamo soon after. The mission was no shining fortress. It was an aging complex of walls, open spaces, patched defenses, and men trying to look steadier than they felt. Crockett's presence lifted spirits. Accounts suggest that he was valued both as a marksman and as a source of morale, someone whose talk could loosen fear for a while. There is something deeply fitting in that. At the end of his life, what he offered was still the same mixture he had long offered: skill with a rifle, and skill with the human heart. Then Santa Anna's army arrived, and the siege began. Cannon fire pressed on the defenders day after day. Sleep would have been thin. Nerves would have frayed. Dust, smoke, shouted orders, and the repetitive labor of watching, waiting, and conserving powder became the texture of time. Some accounts place Crockett and his Tennessee men firing with remarkable steadiness, especially when ammunition for larger guns had to be saved. One report from inside the fort says he paused in the chapel to pray before returning to his post. Another unofficial historical account suggests he joined a mission outside the walls during the siege. Around the Alamo, certainty breaks apart quickly. What remains clear is that he stayed. It is tempting, with so famous an ending, to force the story into one clean image. But the truth is more troubled. On the morning of March 6th, Mexican forces attacked before dawn. The bombardment had ceased, perhaps lulling the defenders for a short while. Then ladders rose, musket fire cracked, and the final assault moved fast. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. Inside that narrow stretch of time, men who had become symbols in later memory were still just bodies under strain, loading, firing, shouting, stumbling, and trying to hold ground as walls failed around them. How did Crockett die? History refuses to give a single answer. In popular tradition, he fought to the last with rifle, knife, and bare stubbornness, leaving a knot of dead enemy soldiers around him. In the most famous competing account, drawn from a memoir of Mexican officer Jose Enrique de la Pena, Crockett was captured with a few others and executed after the battle. Both possibilities have defenders. Evidence exists on each side. No final piece has settled over the question. That uncertainty, strangely enough, suits him. A man so remade by story would not leave the world in a way all witnesses could agree upon. If you hold the Last Stand version for a moment, you see the public hero fulfilled. Crockett in the open, too far from shelter, clubbing with an empty rifle as the line collapses around him. If you hold the execution account for a moment, you see something perhaps even more tragic. A famous defender surviving the roar only to meet death face to face after it. Neither image is restful. Both are human. And behind both stands the same fixed point. He did not turn back. He came to Texas, entered the Alamo, and died there when the place fell. After the battle, the defenders' bodies were burned. Their ashes were later gathered imperfectly, and even their resting place carries uncertainty. That, too, feels part of the story. A man who spent his life in motion did not receive a neat final boundary. Instead, his end dispersed into smoke, witness, rumor, grief, and national memory. The Alamo became a rallying cry. Crockett became one of its brightest names. Yet if you step back from the smoke, what lingers is not only heroism, it is choice. He had already known disappointment, age, family ties, and public life. He could have stayed in Tennessee and become a relic while still alive. Instead, he followed one more horizon. The road carried him from a Nolichucky country to San Antonio, from cabin boy to congressman to volunteer in a doomed garrison. By the time the sun rose fully over the broken walls, the man was gone. The legend, however, had only begun its widest journey. After Davy Crockett died, the country did not let him rest as a single thing. It did what countries often do with figures they half understand and wholly need. It divided him into pieces, then kept whichever pieces were most useful. One age wanted the fearless hunter. Another wanted the blunt congressman who would not bow to a powerful president. Another wanted the martyr of the Alamo. Another wanted the cheerful man in a coonskin cap who could fit neatly in his song, television, lunchboxes, and childhood memory. The remarkable part is that all those versions, even when simplified, still circle a real human core. Part of the endurance comes from the shape of his life. Crockett was born in a place barely formed, rose through labor rather than inheritance, spoke with a voice people recognized as their own, and died at a charged historical moment before age could turn him ordinary. Such lives are especially vulnerable to legend because they end before explanation catches up. Nothing flattens myth like decades of quiet retirement. Crockett never had them. He remained forever in motion, forever on the edge of another undertaking. But the deeper reason he lasts is that he carries both promise and warning. He embodies self-making, yet his life reminds you that self-making has limits. He could talk his way into public affection, but not always into victory. He could oppose Andrew Jackson on Indian removal, and that courage still deserves notice. Yet he also belonged to a frontier world entangled with dispossession and slavery, and he himself enslaved people. To remember him honestly, you have to let the admiration and the discomfort remain in the same room. Folk heroes are usually polished. Historical understanding asks for less polish and more truth. That truth does not diminish him. In some ways, it deepens him. A flawless symbol can inspire from a distance, but a contradictory person can keep speaking across centuries because you recognize the rough edges as human. Crockett could be vain, strategic, funny, wounded, principled, and self-dramatizing in a single season. He knew how to cultivate an audience. He also knew how to risk losing it. He laughed easily, but he voted in a way that cost him. He stepped into myth, yet occasionally tried to push back against it. You can feel in that tension why he never became merely decorative. His afterlife has been enormous. Counties, schools, parks, forests, statues, and songs have carried his name. The Disney version introduced him to millions who had no reason to know the details of Tennessee land policy or the internal politics of Jacksonian America. A generation learned to see the cap first. Yet even that simplified image tells you something important. It shows how hungry people remain for a figure who seems close to the land, skeptical of polish, and brave in the face of overwhelming odds. Whether or not the details stay accurate, the emotional need stays strong. If you return now to the beginning, to the river country where his life first took shape, the legend softens in a useful way. You can set aside the shiny slogans and see the moving pieces again. A boy hired out because his family was in debt. A teenager running from punishment and learning the road. A hunter carrying food home. A widower rebuilding his household. A local speaker discovering that his stories can move votes. A congressman lodging in a boarding house. A defeated politician turning toward Texas rather than sitting down in bitterness. These are not separate men. They're the layers of one life. And perhaps that is why Crockett still feels close, even after so much retelling. He does not remain in memory because he was the strongest or the purest. He remains because he seems always to be becoming himself in public view, with all the risk that involves. You can watch him try on roles and be tried by them in return. Hunter, husband, legislator, soldier, celebrity, exile, defender. None is the whole answer. Together, they make a figure large enough for legend, but grounded enough for sympathy. So when the story settles, let it settle gently. Let the smoke of the Alamo thin. Let the shouting move far off. Let the theatrical cap and the impossible bare stories drift to the edges for a while. Keep instead the quieter sounds. water along stones, an axe in timber, a rifle carried over a shoulder, laughter from a courthouse yard, wagon wheels heading toward another uncertain line on the map. That is where Davy Crockett still walks best, not as a perfect statue, but as a restless frontier soul, half history and half inheritance, moving through the American imagination because he first moved so vividly through the world itself. And if the legend endures, perhaps it does so for a simple reason. It reminds you that a life can be rough, improvised, compromised, and still unforgettable. It reminds you that speech can matter as much as force, that conscience can surface unexpectedly in public life, and that fame often reveals as much about the listeners as about the person they cheer. The river remains. The ridges remain. The old roads are quieter now. But somewhere in the space between fact and folklore, Davy Crockett keeps his place, not entirely captured by either one. There he stands at last, not rushing forward, not disappearing, simply held in the long, low echo of a story people are still telling. And that's where this story comes to a rest. Close your eyes, carry this story with you, and slowly drift off to sleep. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to Close Your Eyes, Listen to Stories. There's always a new story waiting for you here. Sweet dreams.